tell y'all what it's like being male, middle class, and white.
Could you give us a brief overview of what inspired you to run for board?
So, as you well know, and other people should well know, I edited the newspaper Honi last year, and during my time as an Honi editor, I realised that the University of Sydney Union was an imperfect organisation, and that it needed reform. So, some of that reform was to do with transparency within the organisation, which was something that we pushed massively last year, and a lot of which has been implemented, which is great, but some more accountability stuff needs to happen as well. And it was also to do with inclusiveness of students, so I edited the international students section of Honi, and one of the things that I realised was a lot of international students feel left out of the USU, and in particular left out of domestic student events, and that was something that I really wanted to reform.
Did you want to speak to your brand at all, and could you tell us who your campaign manager is?
Sure, yeah, so my brand is Cool Tie-Dye, as inspired by Monica Wren, amazing artist. This was all of her idea, so thank you, Monica. My campaign manager, I have a couple of people doing different things, so Monica is the artistic visionary, Andrew Passarello is the tech visionary, Liv Roden, who's a really good friend of mine, is giving me some advice about the campaign and like telling me whether policies are feasible and stuff like that. And then other than that, yeah, those are kind of the big people. Oh, as well as obviously, sorry, Jack, Hume, and Zoe Zadchek are managing on the ground.
Cool. How would you describe your political views?
I think progressive is probably where I'd start. So some of my policies obviously indicate that I want reform to the organisation that I'm running for. I'm not just kind of a happy-go-lucky candidate who's keen with what it is and happy for it to maintain its kind of current trajectory. I really think the organisation needs to be changed in important ways. But yeah, other than that, my committed values are inclusivity of the union, so including more people that haven't or aren't currently represented, and also making the union much more accountable.
Progressive's been a pretty popular buzzword for
Sure.
campaign candidates in like the last few years. What's the difference between branding yourself as progressive as opposed to branding yourself as left-wing?
That is an interesting question. Probably not one just of semantics. I think that, I mean, I probably could also brand myself as left-wing, to be honest, in answer to the question directly. I don't really think there is too much of a difference. I could only choose 3 buzzwords for the slide on Facebook, so I chose progressive instead of left-wing. But yeah, they are quite similar, like commitments to transparency and accountability are pretty much a cause of the left and a cause of progressive people. But I think something that everybody can kind of get behind. I mean, like, Kerrod Green is campaigning on transparency within the union, something he considers to be important. I feel like for all students, every one of whom pays staff fees, they should be interested in how the money's spent, which is what transparency is about.
And just since you've started talking about the other candidates, which of the other candidates would you say you most identify with politically, and which ones do you least identify with politically?
Least is probably easier, so I'm very divergent from Kerrod's beliefs. So Kerrod thinks that the union should be corporatised, should be an organisation that's run for profit. I don't. I think that, unfortunately, fortunately, the reality of the USU is it doesn't have to be profitable. It doesn't have to be an organisation that kind of like sucks students dry and takes all of their money. And I also think that students who are not able to provide a lot of money also deserve the services of the union, given that they're obliged to pay for it by staff. So, yeah, Kerrod is probably a candidate who I have a lot of difference with. I'm not sure. I know Jennifer Zinn, is being run by Salk. I share a lot of ideological differences with Salk, although I like a lot of Jennifer's policies, so I don't really know where to stand on Jennifer. People that I identify strongly with, I really like Marco Avina. I think he's got like a really good activist background. He's like obviously really committed to his beliefs, and I respect that a lot. Also, his policies are good, and he seems like a nice guy. I've had a good chat with Lemise, who I think is really nice as well, and awesome. And also, he's kind of very consistent with my vision for a more inclusive union. So Lemise represents a group of students in Muslim women, because she's part of the Sydney Uni Muslim Women's Association, that haven't really been represented enough on board or on campus. Mm-hmm. And that's something that I really kind of think is great. Otherwise, Tiff is a good friend of mine, and I think she's capable and true to herself and honest, and those are all things that I value in people that I'd like to work with.
Have you given much thought to preferences?
Not really, to be honest. One thing that's I think is important is I want to negotiate my own preferences. I'm not going to subcontract that out to some kind of campaign manager or amorphous hack, because I think it's important to preference people whose values you share and whose ideology you consider to be good.
From the sounds of things, it seems like you don't have like a factional backing coming into this. Do you think that is going to significantly disadvantage you the way it disadvantaged Liv Ronan during preference deal negotiation last year?
I might get locked out. That'd be a shame, obviously, for me electorally, but if I get locked out as a result of the Labor people locking up and being factional hacks, so be it.
Who would you vote for as president of the USU if you were elected?
Yeah, this is the time where I feel I need to touch wood. If I were elected, I would vote for Liv Ronan for presidency. She's somebody who I know really, really well, and I know is committed to things that don't look glamorous or great, but are important. So, for example, she's at the moment reforming the way in which all the working parties in the USU actually operate to make sure that when board directors have good ideas, that they go from the kind of embryonic idea stage all the way through to getting that idea implemented. At the moment, there's like this really weird, convoluted process where you're like, not sure whether you should go to a working party with your idea or whether they should come to you and ask you about your ideas. There's whole problems with consultation. So she's working on that, which, to be honest, is not glamorous, but is the kind of nitty-gritty of what the union actually does. And I think it's important. Other things like that, she worked on the anti-stacking measures for CNS, which are an important part of the union maintaining kind of integrity in its program. So that's like allowing people to report stacks after they've had a CNS meeting, if they have a concern about that, and also making sure that people feel like their clubs and societies aren't being violated by other people from outside. And the last thing is, I think she's got good values as well. She was the person who pushed the motion to have Alexander Wright removed from the USU, which I think was a really values-driven motion and something that's important because I think the union is a values organisation and it always should be.
A lot of board directors have in the past said that they're against the idea of Senate-appointed board directors electing the president of the union, and they would not seek their votes, only to 12 months later seek the votes. Would you say now that if you were to be running for an executive position next year on the USU, you would not seek?
I would not seek their votes. I can tell that straight to the camera. Yeah.
Good. Great.
Yeah, for the reason that they're really, really capable people. They have a lot of experience in the world. They're good business people or good people in outside organisations, but they're not students, and the USU is a student organisation. And even if it was to my political disadvantage not to seek their votes, I wouldn't do it.
I guess another question on the same vein.
Yep.
Under what's, and this is like, I'm sure you'll understand where this is coming from Honi last year, but under what circumstances would you consider it appropriate to breach your duty to the board, your fiduciary duty to the board, for the greater good?
If it's really strongly in the interest of students at large. So I feel like the union is very much obliged to all students, not just access card holders. And I mean, Tom Morrow is probably the notable case here. Obviously somebody who saw his interest to students as competing with his fiduciary duties to the union. I'd probably be a little bit maybe different from the way in which Rowie behaved in exercising that responsibility. So instead of like maybe leaking a really important document, I would, for example, try and convince people in the union that it was important to disclose that document. So like really work hard internally to be like, hey, this is important, students need to know about this stuff. But if that stuff didn't work, I probably would still release the material in the end, because in that case it was a really serious allegation, and I feel that board directors owe students an important duty.
Do you think the board acted in the right way punitively with respect to Robbie Magyar and Liam Carrigan's allegations of cab charge abuse? And if not, do you think they should have been harsher or less harsh?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I mean, obviously they deserve to be censured. They did something that was totally inconsistent with the way in which cab charges are meant to be used, which is like obviously just the only prerequisite for whether or not to censure them. I think it's difficult about whether or not they should have been booted off board. I think that's probably a little bit excessive. I mean, this was a kind of like violation of something that they probably should have upheld, but yeah, it's a very tough question. I wouldn't have removed. I think it's very, very serious to remove a board director. There have been instances in the past where people have done things that were wrong, that we've considered to be wrong, and if, for example, Robbie and Liam are willing to pay back the money that they misspent on the cab charge, I'm fine with that. But I think in the future, perhaps now that this has happened, the union should be probably more hardline on violations like this.
How would you distinguish the case with board directors Magyar and Carrigan from what happened to Al Stevenson in 2011 when the director was kicked off? Do you think that there was just a greater magnitude in the previous one, or? Yeah,
I suppose magnitude is one part of it. To be honest, in large part, I'm not actually entirely sure of what the board discussions around the cab charge stuff was. So, like, if Liam and Robbie had any reasonable excuses for what they'd done or any mitigating factors. In the case of breaching your electoral spending regulations, it's a pretty obvious and clear violation. Like, you know how much money you've spent, you know how much you're allowed to spend. But in this case, I don't know whether they had any reasonable excuses that I might allow to like mitigate what they did in any way. Yeah.
Cool. To that end, would you support the full divulgence of all financials and expenses of board directors?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So that means everything like cab charges, how they spend their meal vouchers, how they spend discretionary budgets if they get them, but also things like the CEO's salary. Those things should be known to students. It's really important. There's no student organisation in the world that deserves $3.4 million a year of students' money that shouldn't also be accountable for how it spends it.
And in terms of that, what do you think is the most pressing reform needed for like money allocated to board directors? Like, do you think that we should be increasing salaries? Do you think we should be increasing meal cards? Because there's been talk of sort of both as mitigating factors for like the cost of living and all that stuff.
Yeah, this is a really difficult issue. I mean, board directors are... There's no really clear parameters about how much they're expected to work, like how long they're meant to be in the office, what exactly they're meant to do. other than obviously their director's duties, which are reasonably vague in that respect. I think it is a concern that board directors might not be paid enough. So paid $4,000 a year as a regular board director, if you're really doing your job well, that is probably not very much money for the time that you're spending, which is hard. I mean, a lot of people are like, the presidential salary, $26,000 looks huge, but you're working like essentially a full-time job as the president, and I really don't think that is an excessive amount of money to do that. Obviously, if people aren't doing their jobs, they should be reprimanded or they should be censured or whatever, but for the people that are, I think they're paid reasonably fairly, but probably should be paid a bit more. But I understand that that's kind of politically unpalatable in a student environment that tries to save money.
And just moving a bit, what do you think have been the policy achievements and failures of the current board?
Well, I think some of the policy achievements, the big ones, are things that are kind of consistent with my vision for the union. Things to do with transparency, so like allowing tweeting of meetings and tweeting of staff. All those things are like important to accountability. Staff are like really, really, really important to the USU, but also deserve to be accountable to the students as well, because they do things that are, they essentially make decisions that are the implementation of the politics of the USU. So it's important that people know what's going on with them and what they want to do, so long as they're not being defamed. Obviously, that stuff shouldn't be allowed and is regulated by Australian law. Other than that, yeah, that's like the transparency stuff I think is really, really good. Also publishing more detailed minutes from meetings, so stuff like publishing the votes of particular board directors. Before it was like, this vote's a 5-7 split, it went one way. Whereas now it's like, here's how each board director voted. And I think that's really important for the people that elected them to be like, I can see how their vision for the union's being implemented in the way that they're voting.
So, and just in terms of implementing a policy, could you speak to firstly what you think is your most important policy you've put forward?
Sure.
And secondly, how you might see yourself implementing that over your first 12 months as a director?
Yeah, so I think the most important policy I'm putting forward is about international students. So international students now make up 23% of main campus at the undergraduate level, and Sydney Uni looks like, because the feeder regulation stuff didn't go through, will take on more international students in the future, and I think the uni owes them a really big obligation. These are people who pay a huge amount of money to go to this university, $35,000 a year in some cases, and I feel like the union as a student organisation that receives their staff money should be obliged to those people. I also feel it's mutually beneficial to the USU as well, so the USU gets presumably more access card holders, but also a better negotiating position at SAF, when they're like, we literally truly do represent all students. So international students is my big focus, one of my big focuses. How would I implement the policy? I think there are a couple of steps. First is, for some international students, not all international students, obviously 23% of the undergraduate population is a lot of people. For some of them, English language speaking is a problem, and English language comprehension is an issue. So one thing that I really like to do is publish more USU documents in foreign languages. So the USU tried to do this, or did this reasonably well earlier this year with their Say Hello to Uni Life campaign, where there were a couple of documents that were printed in different languages. I really think that should be standard for USU documents. So like Spanish, French, Mandarin, Hindi, all the kind of languages that the majority of the world's non-English speaking population speaks and that international students are from, would be really good, a good start. Obviously for most international students, English is reasonably easy, or like definitely English as a second language, they're very competent. So what would I do for those students? I think one of the problems is the international student societies, like UniMates, are really successful. They make people feel welcome and at home. But one of their issues is they're not very well integrated into like the domestic student societies. So one thing that I would really like to do is use the V team or another group in the USU to hold events before big USU events which international students can attend, and then can move from those events to the bigger events, so they like kind of feel a little bit more included in the domestic student community. Because at the moment I just feel like the USU is trying its best, but really needs to do things that are more proactive in terms of integrating these people. That said, the USU already does some really great stuff for international students, which I totally support, like taking them to Manly and Bondi to see Sydney, hosting Australian discussion groups with them in ISL on 2 days a week, I think, which is all really great stuff. It's more about expanding that program and making it something that international students really want to be involved in.
What is the most important USU program and why?
That's a good question. Well, obviously, I mean, I've really enjoyed being involved in debates as a program. Like, it's obviously something that I got a lot of experience in, but I probably wouldn't say it was the most important program. I'm just trying to think. What do people... I'm not really sure. I mean, one of the things that's kind of pretty obvious from my CV is that I'm a bit of an outsider in the USU, so I've kind of been involved in a lot of things. I've been involved in debates and 180 degrees, but the perspective that I come from is from a student editor perspective, somebody who's been critical of the organisation and doesn't see it as much from within but from without. So yeah, I'm not really sure. Yeah.
Which institution do you think does more for student welfare, the union or the SRC, and why?
I mean, the two organisations do completely different things. The SRC does really, really important things in providing a caseworker service and a legal service and an excellent student newspaper, but the union does things to make people feel more included in the social life of campus. So a lot of students don't really know what the SRC is, don't know what it does, but a lot of students know what a club or society is. They know what Manning or Herman's are. They know all of the restaurants on campus. So I think it's kind of like, it's a bit silly to compare them, given that they're like totally different institutions. But that said, I feel that those two institutions are vastly more important than some of the other institutions that get SAF money. So SUSF is the case in point, I think, that gets a lot of SAF money and doesn't do anything near as important as, for example, the SRC does or the USU does.
There isn't really a precedent for the USU and the SRC to interact, but I think that several of their aims definitely overlap.
True, yeah.
And certainly a lot of the other candidates have talked about how they have a couple of objectives that really align with some of the things that the SRC is trying to do.
Okay.
Is pursuing that discussion something you'd be interested in? Is there a way that you think you can negotiate a relationship between the union and the SRC? And do you know why it hasn't happened so far?
Yeah, actually, sorry, that's a good question. I was a bit dismissive before. You are right. They do have some aims that interact, making students feel more included, representing students, all that kind of stuff. I think that one thing that the USU could learn from a lot is collectives. So collectives are obviously groups of people on campus who meet together and discuss issues that are relevant to their identity, and in a lot of cases they have relevant things to say or to critique about the way in which the USU or the SRC operates, which should be taken into account by the USU, and I feel like it's really wrong to ignore. So that's like things like the queer collective, things like the women's collective. All of these groups have experience in areas that could be really relevant and important to the USU. I think I'm kind of lucky in that I know some people who are already involved in those organisations, so I'm good friends with Sabita Vimalaraja, who's the women's officer, and I would totally be interested in the USU pursuing campaigns with them. But I think that some of the overlap that's already occurred between people who are kind of involved in the USU and the SRC is really good. So for example, Ivana Radix, who is a member of NLS, ran recently a session where students were able to go to the USU and produce like birthing kits for people who are from nations where access to easy birthing kits wasn't readily available, and that's like a situation where a lot of people from the women's collective, for example, endorse that thing, and it's like a good overlap in aims between the two groups. So yeah, I feel like the USU sometimes has the money to implement policies that SRC might not.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, do you want to speak to your experience that you have that you think is relevant to the pursuit of board direction?
Sure.
Especially given that the job is largely bureaucratic and administrative.
Yep. So obviously my kind of most prominent experience is as a former Honi Soit editor. That involved critiquing and kind of deconstructing the USU for all people to understand and see, which is something that was really helpful for me in terms of understanding the institution. So understanding, for example, the relationship between staff and students, which I didn't really get before. Understanding how the CEO works in relation to the board is something that's really important. So yeah, Honi gave me a really good insight into the USU, but I've also been kind of, in some ways, involved from the inside. So for example, in debating, which I really enjoyed at the USU, I've been on debates committee as the schools officer, and that's something where literally like the meetings of debates committees are very procedural, involve a lot of people kind of, you know, like providing reports, making sure that they do things correctly and consistently with the committee, and I've really enjoyed working with that group of people to implement things. But yeah, it's kind of like a really practical on-the-ground role, which is more inside of the USU, and finally my experience in 180 Degrees, which is a charity consulting organisation on campus. I really enjoyed that when I was in first and second year, and that gave me a little bit of a taste of what it was like to be in a big USU club or society, and to see the structures of how all those organisations work in terms of the hierarchy and in terms of what they can achieve as well.
What was the, like when you were schools officer and debates committee, what did that role entail?
So essentially the big focus of the role is organising the schools day of the debates committee.
Yeah.
So that's where we invite public schools, private schools, a whole bunch of schools. It depends on which schools day. And we essentially provide debating training for them. So they debate and we give them adjudications. Sometimes we also do demo debates in front of them. And it's just like a really good way of getting school students more involved in debating, which is an activity that I really enjoy. But we also, when in my time as schools officer, have tried to do a couple of other things. So last year there was a public schools day and a women's schools day, which we think are really important because a lot of time in Sydney, private schools get a whole bunch of debating training, particularly private boys' schools, and women are left out of that, or public schools are left out of that. And one of the things that I was committed to at the schools level was continuing that program that Sarah Morty started last year, which is awesome. The other thing is schools day is a really good revenue raiser for the USU. So it's a way the USU making money and somewhat subsidising the cost of debating, which is an expensive activity.
Do you think affirmative action for public school students in debates, has that been a successful policy initiative?
It hasn't been perfect, to be honest. So what we established this year on committee was what's called a blacklist, which is a list of schools that should only have, if students went to those schools, they shouldn't be included in an affirmative action quota. So it's schools like Grammar, it's schools like MLC, Sydney Girls, Sydney Boys, all big schools with established debating traditions. What we wanted to try and do was to broaden the access to debating so other students could get involved. Unfortunately, the blacklist was a little bit weak, to be honest, so it wasn't, I don't think it even came into play as like they didn't have to enforce the AA policy because we already had people coming from schools that were underrepresented, but they weren't really schools that were underrepresented. So for example, Fort Street had a lot of debaters in this year's Easters contingent, and people from that school already have some debating coaching and are usually like really capable, and I think maybe we could put them on the blacklist as well. But to be honest, like the sentiment was good. Our value was we want more people included in this program, and it'll take a couple of years to get it right.
Cool. Debates is a pretty expensive program.
True.
And it's something that a lot of left candidates have listed, I assume will list,
Yep.
in terms of savings, particularly in response to this question, which is if you had to cut $1 million from the USU's budget, where would you make them?
Some of the money would probably have to come from debating, and in the interest of fairness. So that's things like, it's very, I know it's really difficult at a student level to means test things because people don't necessarily have conventional like income streams and they don't have conventional assets. But things like making sure that you only fund people's flights and registration rather than giving them sometimes extra money to go to tournaments that they can spend in the country seems a bit much for a student organisation. Maybe looking towards, one of the things that I'm really interested in doing, instead of kind of looking at the savings side, is to look at the revenue side. So to kind of be like for debating, for example, could we hold more profitable schools days? Could we look to schools days that raise more money and subsidise debating as an activity a bit more? So that's something that I've worked on this semester. Other areas that savings could come from, I don't know. Just trying to think if there are... I don't know, I mean, student organisations, the USU is a pretty lean organisation. After the abolition of compulsory student unionism, the USU really had to cut back on a lot of things, which I think in some ways is a shame, but I don't really think that they're flagrant in their expenditure or anything like that. I think they're pretty reasonable and responsible. Yeah, so, yeah, debating would be one area which money could come from. Yeah.
Sure.
Do you want to hit just a couple of those?
Yes, sure. A lot of the other candidates have listed accessibility for low SES students
Yep.
In their policy statements. Is there any reason in particular why it doesn't feature in yours?
No, I knew that from talking to a couple of the other candidates that they would mention that stuff, and I think it's all really, really great. I think that one of the problems with that policy is it doesn't take into account what's already happening in the USU. So the USU already has a plan for access to be free in a couple of years, which is something that it's pushing towards, which is great, but it kind of makes the policy a bit redundant. In some respects, it's a good policy for that kind of interim period, but I think in the long term, it's probably not that big a deal. Although that said, I totally agree with the policy. I think it's good. So subsidies for international students, and also one group that I think that's not going to be focused on in this election that is really important for the future of the USU is what happens to all the students from Cumberland who end up on this campus. Because currently we have a whole campus at Cumberland. It will be here in 3 years' time, and we have to proactively provide those people with the services and provisions that they need without them being a voter base in the election, which is a very, very hard thing to do. It's something that I'm committed to doing. That means like better facilities down near Charles Perkins Centre, where most of them will be educated.
But in terms of that interim period before
Yeah.
access is free,
Sure.
what do you think is the sustained benefit of an access card for someone from a low ACS background?
It's difficult. I mean, a lot of the things that people who use Access can get are things that are related to having free time, to being able to not have to work a job, something like that. I think the Access card could be better value for money for low SES students. So, for example, one of my policies is expanding the discounting program that already exists. So, currently applies to buy 6, get 1 coffee free. I think it could apply to stationery and to meals and to other things that students buy that the USU offers. That's an easy way to get good value for money out of it. Yeah, that's like, I think, a pretty easy way which to make it more worthwhile, because for a lot of students, other things preclude them from accessing the union.
We've heard rumour that the USU is looking to get rid of the CNS committee and streamline approving clubs and societies directly through the board.
Sure.
What do you think the role of the board is in intervening to approve societies, usually for political reasons? Like the thing I'm referring to here is BroSoc.
Yeah, sure.
And then the second part of the question, this one's from one of the readers, which is that if BroSoc were to reform its its structures and its constitutions and work towards alleviating a lot of the concerns people had in advance, do you think there is a place for a society like that on campus?
Okay, cool. So in answer to your first question about the CNS committee, I think it's a bit of a farce to think that the CNS committee is anything other than political. It's an organisation that is disproportionately loaded with people from a couple of years ago who were part of the Young Libs. because the Liberal Party on campus, as I investigated last year in Honi, were very, very concerned by the idea that somebody might stack out Sulk and destroy the soft right control of Sulk, which is a huge vested interest that they have in the organisation. Obviously not everybody on the board of CNS is a young Lib, but I think that one of the things that's important to note is the CNS committee is deferent to the board. So what happens is CNS committee approves a decision, says this society can be accepted, and then sends it to the board for rubber stamping. And I think there's a bit of a problem with that, because I think the board, as the student elected representatives, should really be making decisions like that. I mean, that's the reason that we elect them, to make decisions on our behalf. And I don't think that the CNS committee, that's just like a arbitrarily appointed organisation by CV, should make decisions of that scale. So I probably wouldn't mind if the process was streamlined a little bit more, and the board had more power over those decisions, and the CNS committee had either none or less power. But yeah, that's something to look into in the future, as you say. Second part of the question about BroSoc. I think that BroSoc was right to be rejected as it was. I think that it was a society that was kind of seemed to be quite gender exclusive for obvious reasons, perhaps even its name, and one that promoted values that are probably not that consistent with the egalitarian aims of the USU, i.e. the idea that everyone feels included, people don't feel alienated by their gender status or something like that. I think that BroSoc could reform to be a society that the USU should want to accept, but it would be probably as a men's mental health awareness society or something like that, something that actually offered a real benefit to the student community, rather than being an opportunity for people to crush cans and talk about maleness. I just don't think that's really that valuable a concern. Although, obviously, if it did something like men's mental health, it would become a valuable organisation.
If you were elected to the board, what improvements would you do for USU democracy generally?
So I suppose there are a couple of areas where democracy applies. One of them is actually on the board itself. So I would stand against Senate-appointed directors voting in directors' elections. I don't feel that's appropriate. So that's one area of democracy that's pretty important, because they have 2/13 of a say in who becomes the president, which is a really big deal. In terms of general elections, as in the election that we're running for now, I think there are a lot of things that need to be reformed. The election process is pretty brutal on candidates, but it's even more brutal on the people who just want to walk from Redfern without being harassed and get to their classes. I think the USU needs to think about ways in which to make that less abrasive and horrible, but also in ways to kind of make sure that people respect the consent of students as campaigners, and ensure that they're not forcing their agenda on them or trying to curry their favour by doing things that are kind of a bit untoward, like not respecting their right to say no, is important. Other than that, I can't really think of any important democracy changes.
How will you negotiate that? I mean, a lot of things are taken for granted as necessary evils on the campaign trail.
Yeah.
Is it going to be the case that this is a policy you formulate on the one hand and then act against while it can't be, until it can be implemented in the other?
I mean, it's a difficult problem. At the moment, there's obviously an incentive to continue doing things that are politically advantageous, even if they don't seem morally right. But some things that the USU's forbidden, or that other student organisations forbidden under the SSC, like postering and stuff, they were just like, there's too much of a cost to this, for example, to the environment, we should just stop doing it. I think if we started doing those things more unilaterally, some other really basic things, like for example, A-frames are something that's a real trip hazard for people who are vision impaired, and I'm kind of like, well, maybe that's a thing that could go. I remember talking to Beck Wong about it before and not even realising that it had been an issue, but her saying that it was kind of like a reasonably big deal for vision impaired people. That might improve the process of democracy a bit. Mm-hmm. Other than that, I think, democracy is imperfect, but as you say, some of the things are quite difficult to reform. But I wouldn't kind of act against the idea of reforming them. I would just obviously have to be realistic about what would be allowed, but wouldn't violate the other aspect of democracy, which is people's right to campaign to voters, people's right to tell them about their policies. I would also really hope that faculties would be more open in allowing candidates to lecture bash lectures. Some faculties just have a blanket ban on it, which I understand in some respects, like it's annoying, it interrupts the start of your class, but if the USU wants to include more people in the democratic process, you need to be able to tell psychology students what the process is about, you need to be able to tell pharmacology students what the process is about as well, so it's not just the domain of arts and law students.
Sure.
Yeah.
Cool.